From the perspective of the Ada Lovelace Institute, we published a report 2 weeks ago called Exit Through the App Store, which started to air some of the technical considerations and societal implications of using technology to exit the crisis. And digital contact tracing was one of the technical interventions that we discussed in that paper. At that point, 2 weeks ago, there was not really any clarity around what approaches different governments would be taking. And in the last 2 weeks, we've seen a range of different approaches emerging. There's been a kind of public tussle between some governments and Apple and Google, notably France. We've seen Germany choose to go the route of a decentralized model. And in the UK, we've seen NHSX roll out or announce that they will be rolling out their own bespoke app based on a centralized model. From Ada Lovelace Institute's perspective, there's kind of three buckets of questions or concerns or ongoing conversations that we think there should be have. One is around the efficacy of contact tracing, digital contact tracing, I should say. One is around the technical and legal safeguards and measures. So that would include the technical architecture question, but also what legal and policy instruments might support digital contact tracing. And the third is around public trust, and it connects obviously very clearly to the first two. That is, you can't have public trust in a digital contact tracing system unless you have both efficacy and legal safeguards and technical safeguards demonstrated. In the UK, we understand that the NHS will be rolling out their app in the next 2 to 3 weeks for public usage. And it feels like there are a range of unanswered questions. And so I'm going to ask the panelists today to highlight some of those from their perspective, and indeed to critique this conversation or other conversations that are underway. And then we'll turn it over to the attendees to put some questions to the speakers. So to begin with, I'm going to ask Ross Anderson from Cambridge University to kick us off with his thoughts. Is it the case, Ross, from your perspective, that public health and privacy are at odds in a conversation around digital contact tracing, or do you think that we can satisfy ourselves that a digital contact tracing system could be sufficiently private and secure so as to be legitimate from the perspective of somebody who's expert in cybersecurity and computer science?
I think this debate is basically misplaced because Britain is building a contact tracing system now in accordance with World Health Organization guidelines. So instead of having 280 people that do contact tracing, we're going to have 18,000. There will be 3,000 people with clinical experience, retired doctors and nurses for the most part, and a whole lot of volunteers who will phone people up who have reported symptoms or who have got positive tests, and will trace down these contacts. The central issue is what happens to that data afterwards. It will be fully identifiable data, names, dates, times, addresses, contacts, phone numbers, everything. And if we had a proper legal regime for this, as we do in Taiwan, then it would be mandatory to destroy such information once the pandemic is over, or even in fact after 22 days, as they're doing in Australia. But in Britain, they propose to keep all the data forever so that we can use it for research. This is where the rubber hits the road in the UK. Now, you can mitigate privacy harms from the very small digital component of this if you encrypt stuff, but you can't encrypt, but you can't mitigate them completely. There's all sorts of ways in which even relatively anonymous digital contact tracing will leak stuff. However, the main issue is what happens to the vast bulk of the data that is collected by conventional means. And I suspect that what's going to happen politically is that the digital app won't work, and this will then be used in some kind of blame shifting maneuver, you know, blame privacy activists, blame Google and Apple and so on. The reason why the app probably won't work, whether it's centralized or decentralized, is that Bluetooth just isn't a very good technology for recording contacts. First of all, Bluetooth isn't a ranging technology, and so depending on how you turn up the volume, the range can be anything from, you know, a few centimeters to tens of meters. And if you turn up the volume enough to see almost all the phones that are 2 meters away, you'll see quite a few phones that are 5 meters or 10 meters away. So as well as seeing the person sitting 1 meter away from you in the bus, you'll see people in the bus stop, you'll see people in surrounding apartments and so on and so forth. Second, even if you get 40% of the population to run the app, which is very, very unlikely, then the likelihood that two people who had a significant contact, say sitting 1 meter apart in a bus, will register is 40% squared, which is 16%. So you're still missing more than 80% of all the relevant contacts. And so with false alarm and missed alarm rates like that, the contribution that such an app can make is pretty marginal. And the third problem with the digital contact tracing proposals is that many of them assume that you will type in a positive test result into your phone when you get one. Now, at present, the only people who get tested in Britain are VIPs and people who are taken to hospital. And the VIPs boast of their COVID infection anyway on Twitter, whereas the people who've been taken to hospital are too sick to do anything. Because by the time the test result comes back tomorrow, you know, they're on their back with an oxygen mask on. So for all sorts of reasons, the digital contribution that the app can make to this is going to be marginal. And so rather than focusing on the privacy issues around that, we must focus on the privacy issues around the main databases that will be collected by the large armies of human contact tracers who are now being recruited. And this isn't just a UK issue, this will be an international issue, because every government that wants to push back on this will be recruiting lots of contact tracers, and they will have large data systems, and these will contain large amounts of personal information, which will be hazardous if they're kept forever.
Thank you, Ross. Can I ask you one follow-up question? You pointed out the kind of missing gaps that a contact tracing system would have, even if there was ubiquitous use. We hear from some quarters that there is an argument that any use of the app will be beneficial in this, and I'm kind of assuming here that the rationale for that is it will enable some information, the NHS to gather some information about where people are experiencing symptoms. From your perspective, is it the case that there needs to be a threshold of people met before any benefit is realized, or can we imagine a case in which digital contact tracing apps, when used alongside the manual contact tracing app, could yield some insight, putting aside the privacy concerns for a minute, I suppose? Oh, you're mute, sorry.
I'm more concerned that the digital contact tracing app is already being used as an excuse. Now, it should not have been revealed to the public until about now under the original plans, and yet it was revealed by our health secretary on Easter Sunday in order to deflect attention from a leak in The Guardian about a defence contractor being given access to NHS records. And we anticipate entirely that when it's rolled out and it fails to do much work, the government will then blame Google, Apple, and privacy researchers for getting in the way of public health. And if we then stand up and say, now, hang on a minute, you're helping yourselves to all sorts of records that you're not normally entitled to from GP systems, for example, and you're creating all these new records through your army of contact tracers, what about data protection on that? They'll turn around and say, oh, shut up, you stupid privacy activists, you got in the way already. There's an emergency on and we've got to save lives. Right, so you have to think ahead to how this political game is going to be played. This isn't a marginal technical thing, right? This is serious stuff.
Thank you. We'll turn now to Carmela, who, as I said, was one of the authors of the DP3T model, which is a decentralized, privacy-preserving proximity tracing system. Carmela, we'd like to hear about DP3T, but also it would be very useful to know what the situation is like in Switzerland, what the political conversation there is around the choice of technical architecture, and whether the same types of political arguments in favor of digital contact tracing are being made there.
Thank you, Carly. I have to say that I'm mostly in agreement with Ross in many of the things he said. So one thing is that this app is indeed a very small piece of the big puzzle that we need to solve in order to get out of this crisis. The app, as he said, is only a support for these manual contact tracers. And I completely agree with him that at this point in time, there is a lot of unclarity about what will happen with that data that probably has much more privacy content and it's much more powerful than the app, the data that you can collect from the app. Now, as he said in the last part of his intervention, these apps in many ways seems like an excuse in order to get data. We don't know where they come from. We don't know some of the designs or like kind of the secretism behind how and why these apps are being developed. And here is where myself and the large group of researchers that work with me from many places in Europe felt that it was our duty to come up, step up, and make sure that this excuse cannot be used by producing an alternative that enables the functionality that is being used as an excuse, regardless of whether all of these errors that Ross said work or not. I'm with him. We are not 100% sure that this will work, right? We're now making all of these tests with soldiers here in Switzerland in order to make sure that the Bluetooth is as good enough as we can calibrate it. But we cannot make an experiment with 1,000 people out in the street or in a bus because it is unethical at this point in time to actually put them in that situation. So indeed, because we're going to deploy an extremely invasive technology and we're going to ask hundreds of millions of Europeans to put this on their pockets and hang it with them, around with them, it is extremely important that we have an alternative that produces data that cannot be exploited beyond this, the purpose of contact tracing. And that is what we're trying to do with DP3T, to provide this alternative, to put on the discussion a design point that doesn't mean that there is a trade-off between, oh, we need these apps, or whatever reason we're not really in the discussion, right? We can have the discussion as well, do we need the apps or not? But if political decision is we need these apps, then we need to have on the table an option that does not create a database that, as Ross said, are extremely dangerous because we have no control on how are they going to be used in the future. And in regards of what's the situation in Switzerland with respect to these apps, there is a quite good understanding that the apps are, as I said, a very small part of the solution. And we're moving towards having more and more manual contact tracing and see how the apps can be used as a complement in order for this to work. And when we designed DP3T, we had all of these things in mind. So as I say, one of them was the privacy of the users. The system should not be built at expenses of users' privacy. The system should not create data that can be encrypted in the function that it is used. It should not be produce data that can be repurposed on a database that we have no control of. But also it's a system that should be easy to dismantle. We cannot create huge databases that, as Rod said now, what happens if there is no legal safeguard to delete? What happens if after the database is built, then somebody decides that they don't want to press the delete button? So when we thought about the decentralized proposal, what this does, the fact that the server doesn't really hold any useful data for the purpose of, for other purpose other than contact tracing, means that the moment that the population shuts down the app, if we all the Swiss, once this thing is deployed, we remove the app from our phones, that server is useless anymore. There is nothing in there. So these are the things that we're trying to provide to society from the technical side. We don't enter in the discussion about apps are going to be good or bad. We don't enter in the discussion about is this thing needed or not. But if there is a decision, there must be an alternative that does not create a new problem on society.
Is there an argument that a decentralized app would impede public health officials in doing the manual contact tracing they might be able to do if they had more granular information about who's using the app and who's reporting?
As far as I understand, manual contact tracing does not use the app. Manual contact tracing relies on an interview, and whether this app is present or not, I do not understand how the questions of the interview are going to change. The app is a help on top of that. It's a help to the memory of humans, that when they are asked on these interviews, who have you met during the last 2 weeks, right? These interviews are very long. They many times require you, for instance, to look on your calendar so that you remember meetings. But there are many encounters, like even if people I know that I won't remember, like for instance, I think about being at my office at EPFL, and then one of my bachelor students drops in to ask for a question about the exercises. It is extremely unlikely that a week later on, even looking at my calendar, I kind of remember this small thing. And there is also a lot of people that I meet every day that I have no way to contact or knowing their names when I go in the metro to EPFL, when I'm at the supermarket, or when I'm at the bar. So the apps are supposed to help to find out all of this contact, that manual contact tracing, but they can only be thought of as a supplement. And as a supplement, they cannot really help to improve the manual contact tracing. They can only try to extend this notification network to the extent possible.
Just quickly, there's a question in the Q&A from Frederica Lucibero saying, to what extent can the original function of the app really be preserved if the data is localized?
So let us remember that the function of these apps, and know that all the time and say notifying, the function of this app is to notify people that were close to someone that has been diagnosed positive. So our system and many other designs that are decentralized prove that this is possible by even allowing the phone to make the decision. So how the decentralized options work, like many others, people have a phone. This phone is broadcasting these random numbers that change over time so that you cannot be traced based on what you're broadcasting. And how the decentralized approaches work, this random number is generated on the phone. And when phones meet each other, they store the random numbers that they see. And at the point that there is an infection, I will have, or that I am diagnosed positive for an infection, I will have two lists on my phone. One is the numbers that I have been broadcasting, and the other one is the numbers I have been seeing. What the doctor would ask me at that point is if I am willing to notify the people that have seen me. And for that purpose, what I do is to upload the numbers that I have been broadcasting. And this decision, again, is a very well thought decision in the sense that those numbers do not relate to my person. It relates to a key that my phone generated at random. They do not relate to my locations because they are just, again, depending on a key, and they do not relate to how many people I have met or who I have met or when I have met them. These random numbers, these were generated automatically on their own schedule. So when these random numbers are uploaded together with the other random numbers of other people that are diagnosed positively, then other phones can download the number and internally check, have I seen this number? And if they have seen the number, that they can send they can show a notification to the users. So at none of these points, we believe we have not fulfilled the functionality, which is only to put this notification on the phone of people and then let them know you have been close to this person, and depending on where you are, your nation, your government, your regional government will decide what to tell you depending on their capabilities at the point. That can be, you should be quarantined, self-quarantine yourself. You should call a hotline and then tell them more details so that depending on your state, like if you're young, maybe you self-quarantine yourself, but if you're older, maybe it is better that you actually go to the hospital and get checked. Or hopefully in a couple of months, if this actually goes down, they can immediately even give you an appointment for this.
Thank you for that very clear explanation of how it works. I'm going to turn now to Christian to ask his perspective, both from the DG Connect's view on the proliferation of these digital contact tracing apps across Europe. There's a question in the Q&A about how we can ensure interoperability of these apps, and I'm not sure if that's something you've been thinking about. I know also your background in data protection might suggest you have something to say around the privacy issues. And then how do we think about the future of these apps? Where are they going over the coming months?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. This has become an urgent thing in the last 2 or 3 weeks, which is, it all started when people were imagining what contribution digital technology and data could bring to the fight against the pandemic. People started to imagine what sort of apps could be designed and deployed, and there were various solutions out there a month or so ago. But then when they saw what was happening in Singapore and they saw reports that it seemed to be quite privacy friendly, that seemed to generate a momentum of its own behind apps which would somehow support contact tracing. And the EU's is involved in this on a number of different levels. In terms of public health, the EU has a very limited legal competence, so it can support and coordinate what member states are doing, but the responsibility effectively lies with the individual states and governments and authorities. Obviously, the EU is all about the internal market and sustainable growth, and there hasn't been a bigger shock to the internal market in the history of the EU since until the COVID-19 pandemic. But then, of course, there's also the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is part of EU's primary law, and that includes privacy and data protection. So that's basically our motivation to intervene. When we talk about contact tracing, we know that contact tracing is one of the sort of trinity of essential things that need to be done according to epidemiologists and the World Health Organization in order to contain a pandemic. So the other two are testing and isolating. All of these things could potentially be supported by digital tools, but with tracing, as Ross has explained, it's traditionally been done in manual ways. Where there are digital tools to support it, such as through an app, the WHO has said quite clearly that we're in really experimental territory. So we don't know if these apps are going to be effective, whether they're going to really help the efforts. On the other hand, they also say that there is great potential that they could support it for the reasons which Carmela has explained, that it potentially could fill gaps in people's memory, and obviously people won't remember people that they don't know that they've been in contact with, and also there's I was reading recently that there was a you need to try to trace all the contacts that a person who's tested as being infected has had over the last 48 hours. So there is a degree of urgency there. So if we're going to perform this experiment, then we have to make sure that there isn't any collateral damage. And you need to evaluate and disband, as DP3T call it, a graceful dismantling of this app once there's no longer any need for it. Those have been the driving principles behind what we've been developing. That we've published guidance on data protection and privacy, and we were supporting member states in producing a toolbox on the use of these apps, which was published 2 weeks ago. So it basically says that that these and Thierry Breton, the commissioner responsible for this, has said this himself, that the apps have to be voluntary. We can't impose this. We can't impose a solution that we don't even know is going to work. That we have to, as far as possible, use anonymized and encrypted data, so that the amount of personal data which is used is minimized. That we have to be transparent about what we're doing, and that's why a lot of the emphasis is placed on having the code for this, having the programming behind these apps to be open source. That they need to be temporary, so we have sunset clauses. And finally, as one of the one of the Q&A has mentioned, that they need to be interoperable. They need to be interoperable because we want, as the EU, we want to restore freedom of movement across the EU. So in order to do that, we need to lift borders. We need to have deconfinement, which means that if people are carrying this app around, hoping that it will enable them to be alerted quickly if they've been in contact with someone who's tested positive, that should work across borders of the EU. So that's what we're engaged on working on now. Just one final thing to say, where are member states at the moment? Most, but not all of them, have decided that they're going to deploy an approved national app. They're generally familiar with the risks which are inherent to it, not just about privacy, but also things like the fact that it's exposing digital divides, and it's questions of inclusivity and so on. But what we need to recognize is that when you digitize, when you try to find a digital solution, you're doing something at scale, which in and of itself creates a data security problem, risk, that it's going to be imperfect, that there is a risk of stigmatization, false positives and negatives, and also of accountability. So we need to know who is responsible for these apps and hold them responsible for it, and they need to be transparent about what they're doing. That's what we're working on now.
Thank you, Christian. That's great. Can I ask? There's a question in the Q&A about the potential for these apps to become de facto or be repurposed as digital ID type apps, or the same conversation has happened around the additional functionality that may be added onto a contact tracing app around community certification, for example. Is that something that the Commission has started thinking about and looking at? And I expect it may connect to existing work that's happened in the Commission around a Europe-wide identity. Is that, digital identity system, is that the type of thing that you see as being relevant to this conversation, or are they two separate initiatives?
Well, from the beginning, the principle, a key principle of data protection that we've applied here is that the purpose has to be limited. So you have to guard against function creep. It's one of the essential guardrails to all of this, that it's used exclusively for the purpose of supporting efforts in the public health crisis, the pandemic emergency, and that when it's no longer, when we're no longer in this predicament, that it's disbanded, that we stop using it and we delete the data. Now that means that we can't get into a situation where we've created this tool and then we think, oh well, maybe it could be useful for this and for that. There are always discussions about this. I mean, other areas of public policy will be interested in how to adapt this tool for their own purposes, but we've been quite clear that it needs to be limited to that. There is a risk, as if it may well be that we're in. When will we come out of this crisis? It may be that it's a plateau and this is the new normal. In which case, we need to find ways of calibrating our responses so that we don't put in place a degree of surveillance or a degree of data security risk which is unsustainable. So that is why one of the pillars of our of the toolbox that we published was that there needs to be an evaluation mechanism, and that's one of the focal points for our deliberations as well.
And in terms of data deletion at the end of the use of the apps in various countries, is it the feeling at the Commission that there's sufficient protections in existing law to require that, or is in some countries there's been a suggestion that these apps would need implementing legislation in order to have really an ironclad promise that data would be deleted at the end? Is that something that the Commission is recommending, or is it the case that you feel that that's in the GDPR or elsewhere?
Well, the GDPR, insofar as this is about the processing of personal data, is deliberately flexible when it comes to exceptional circumstances. So that there are, it talks about combating pandemics, explicitly in the text. By and large, if you're going to have an app which does this sort of thing, you need to have a legal basis for it. You can rely on public interest, public health, and a number of member states are doing that, which would mean potentially that you can have a under the so-called centralised model, which some member states, not many, are contemplating. You can have, in effect, a person uploading their contact history to a public health authority once they've tested positive. Now that can be legal, and the data protection authorities have said that can be legal if it's set out clearly in the law. But I think a lot of people are tending towards being more cautious because there isn't any hard empirical evidence that this really works. Given the risks, that we're relying more on individual consent, which is what Carmela was describing. So I, as an individual, can consent to my data being used. I can volunteer it to the public health authority. But what I can't do is I can't consent on behalf of other people. That's their right to consent, whether or not their contact should be supplied to a central authority.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Christian. Just picking up a couple of questions in the chat. Ross, there's a few questions here around, you know, how would various things change the effectiveness of the app? So for example, someone asked, does the scale and density of a place influence how effective an app is? Maybe you want to speak to that, but if not, to take a step back and ask, what type of process should the NHS follow in terms of having a strong evidence base to support the technical efficacy of an app like this before it rolls ahead with it? We know they have a model to support their conclusions that an app could be effective and that any use of that app could be effective. Should we have a process whereby they're required to get multiple competing analyses in order before they roll out with the technology like that?
No, at a time like this, you don't do that.
Okay.
Heavyweight bureaucracy is a pain in the arse even in peacetime. And in the case of a crisis, what you do is you do everything. You do everything all at once. You don't have a fancy committee of grey-bearded medical professors to decide which of 7 possible vaccines you do. You fund every single one of them. Even if none of them work and you've wasted $1 billion, that's trouser change. Similarly, if there's any chance at all that an app would work, it was quite all right for the NHS to go ahead in early March with this development. And if it turns out not to work, they must just toss it and not blink. The problem is how this gets involved with the way politicians behave can then make it toxic. So, you know, long-winded design cycles and so on are not what you do here. What you do here is agile. You ship your minimum usable project and then you iterate. That, incidentally, is another problem with the decentralized approach, that iteration is difficult. You know, once you've got something spread out over a large number of platforms, and there's an issue of, you know, updating apps in 169 different varieties of phones. There's also the problem that even if you ship a solution that is initially fairly secure, it's easy enough for people to add features on top of it during the iteration phase. And Carmela was talking about this very well last year at PETS in Stockholm, which will undermine security and privacy. For example, there are people in the British government who like the idea of being able to identify those people who have too many contacts, right? Because if you can neutralize those people who are high vertex order nodes in the graph, those people who meet many other people, then this makes the graph more disconnected, a property that epidemiologists know as fragility. And therefore, even if you don't use the Bluetooth app for contact tracing per se, the mere fact that you could say that, you know, Carly met 200 people last week and Carmela met 100 and Christian met 50, we say, right, let's send Carly an order to self-isolate for 2 weeks. We don't know whether she's got COVID or not, but she's got too many friends. Let's take her out of circulation. You know, from the operational point of view, that might be an entirely justifiable public health intervention. Ethically, many people would have difficulties with it, certainly in peacetime. But this gives you an idea of how complex this thing can be, and how once you field something, even a distributed thing, it can snowball out of control. And so the critical thing is how do, you know, where do we get the fuse? Where do we get the contact breaker that enables us to turn the whole damn database off in 2 years' time once we've got a vaccine?
And I'd like your opinion, and Carmela's as well, on the value of open sourcing the code and underscoring the app. Is that a useful protection from the perspective of the public, from the perspective of security and privacy? Oh,
absolutely. Because unless we've got access to the source code, both of the app and of the underlying mechanisms in iOS and Android, we've got no idea what's going on in there. We've got no idea who put in something to be helpful that then gets discovered and exploited. I mean, people would probably not initially count the number of contacts function in, you know, out of deliberate malice. They would do it to be helpful. But bear in mind that during the Iraq War, we used to kill people on the basis of how many contacts they had. Right, this was how things got done in 2005. If you had too many people that you talked to on your mobile phone, you got a Hellfire missile through your window. And it didn't matter whether you were a bad actor like a mullah or a good actor like, you know, just somebody who maintained a local whorehouse or whatever. The NSA and the US Air Force didn't care. So, you know, you can have things put in for good reasons that end up being applied to things that you can't even conceive of now, and they can end up being applied to very, very unethical purposes indeed. And that's why we absolutely have to have some means to turn the engine off. That is the most important thing. But it is completely against the NHS culture and the medical culture, because they want to keep all the data forever so they can use it for research. That's the fundamental problem here.
Christian, you spoke about how the GDPR is a flexible piece of legislation. One of the questions here is pointing out that it's of course a new piece of legislation as well. Are there any thoughts yet on how, going beyond this crisis, we might need different laws or regulations to prepare ourselves going forward? You know, have we stood the test of this pandemic in the context of legal institutional frameworks, or do we need others?
Well, it's a great question. I'm not really sure what the answer is yet. Every day is different from the last. Things are moving so quickly. I think what we need is well, from an EU perspective, I think what we've seen is that, you know, that there is a lot more we can do in order to have a more coherent response to a genuine crisis like this, which is borderless by its very nature. You know, there's going to be a lot of lessons to be learned from it. Whether you need a specific law, I don't know. I mean, that there are mechanisms in place already for health authorities to share data with each other, you know, very quickly. It's called the European Early Warning and Response System. I'm not sure if you know, that necessarily contains a digital component, but I think what we're doing, if you see the stuff that's been coming out in the last few weeks, is we're starting to build a consensus between the member states about what can and shouldn't be done. So we're slowly establishing precedents. For example, at the moment, you know, we're talking about contact tracing apps, and we're talking about contact tracing apps which minimize the amount of data which is processed. That's not, we weren't all singing from the same hymn sheet a month ago. So, you know, we're doing our best to try to establish these sort of unwritten norms, and whether or not, you know, once we come out of this eventually, whether that exposes the need for additional you know, rules, and I don't know, perhaps.
Great, thank you. A final question for Carmela before we wrap up. Given the direction the UK seems to be going in, as far as we understand, around which is to say not following the DP3T model but a more centralised system, what do you think should be the next steps here?
I think the first step was already taken by hundreds of academics this week by raising the point that such a centralized system is prone to abuse. But before I continue, let me please answer to Ross' latest remarks, where he made a couple of kind of controversial statements about decentralized. So the first one was that decentralized allows you to target particular users. No, that's exactly what the centralized model allows you to do, because that's where you see how many people meet. That's where we want decisions to be made on the phone, so that there is no server that can see what you can observe, how many people you have met, and everything is done locally. And all the information about one individual goes to the server, in particular to avoid that kind of social manipulation and social population control. This is one of the many functional creeps that this type of applications can have that we're trying to avoid. The second one is the fact that in a decentralized system, it is hard to update. Now let's talk about what we are updating. Of course, upgrading apps, it is hard, but let us realize that both centralized and decentralized systems are based on apps. So in that sense, both systems are equally difficult to upgrade if what I actually need is an upgrade on the software. If now we're talking about updating the particular risk estimation function, or something that is about how the notifications are given, that is something that is particularly easy to do. Because let's recall that in a centralized system, my app continuously goes and pulls information from a server, one of the things it can pull is an update of the parameters. We can say now, well, maybe your app does not have access to the server. Cool. Then at that point, I cannot even use the app, right? So these kind of things and this kind of misunderstanding about how the system works are put in the decentralized options, like the question that came before, can you still provide the same functionality? As far as I'm concerned, I have still not seen a thing that people tell me that they can do on a centralized design that cannot be done on the phone of the users at the same speed of updating.
No, I disagree with that, because the sort of thing the NHS guys want to do is that they know they have to process orange alerts rather than red alerts. That is, somebody calls in with symptoms, right? Because calling in with test results is useless for reasons already discussed.
Mm-hmm.
So what you have to do is have a means of parsing the symptoms that somebody reports. You have to take them through a script of, is it a new cough? How long has it gone on? Do you have a temperature? Can you still smell stuff? And so on and so forth. That is probably going to have to be tweaked every few days as people get experience using the system. If those scripts are kept on a central server, they can be updated overnight. But if they are embedded in 169 different apps, you're in the Nexus app, in the Samsung app, in the HTC app, and I don't know what's going to happen with some of the other apps, then that becomes more difficult.
No, you just update it every time you download. You are going to download, you update those parameters, exactly the same thing. Even more, I would say that for many transparency reasons, the decentralized has an advantage, which is that now everybody in the world is going to see what is the update of the parameters, actually putting trust on the users on what they are doing and why they are having an alarm, because we can transparently, as a society, kind of check this thing. When these changes happen overnight on a central server, I would actually be very worried about why do these changes happen and why do I now have an alarm that yesterday I wouldn't have, because I have no way of auditing what is going on.
Well, the argument the NHS will make is that if you want all of the app functionality to be parameterized so that you can update it by changing tables, then you've got a very much heavier development task because you've got to envisage all future functionality that the app might require.
Oh, there is no other functionality that contact tracing.
So that you can simply update that by means of data statements. And, you know, given my own experience of writing software, I'd say that's very, very much harder to do than by updating the actual software.
But now I'm very confused, because now we're saying that we're going to upgrade functionality of the app. Now, even more, I would like this to be decentralized so that every upgrade of the functionality is made transparent to the public and not at the back end of the server. Because now we're allowing, and I'm happy that NHS is publicly saying that they are going to do function creep and increase the functionality of the app. Now, let us remember that the function of the app is to do contact tracing, not symptom getting. If we want to actually have this function on the phone and we are going to have orange alerts, the decentralized system can as well do this thing. Whenever we update something on the server, we can have a flag that actually says this is orange, which can be interpreted by the other phones as a less relevant alert. We can even have a software authentication function that is a code given on the phone by the person that attends you, so that you can try to limit how many of these we can upgrade. Again, we're having a fallacy here that you can do all of these things on a decentralized system.
But the problem is, if you have to conceive of all that and write code into every app, which will enable it to implement all these options by simply tweaking data tables from the center.
But there is no data table, Ross.
It's a development task. I can't, look, I'm an engineer. I don't know how to do that.
But no, we know how to do that. It is done. The app can nowadays do all of these functions in a decentralized manner without any table.
Well, in theory, yes, but in practice, no.
I'm going to stop you. I'm going to stop you there. I let it run a little over because I think this is an incredibly interesting discussion. I'm sure, judging by the fact that 280 people have hung on beyond the end of the webinar to listen to it, it's clear that some of these issues actually aren't resolved, and hearing experts debate them is fascinating. And really important, actually. So thank you really for both airing your opinions on that. Thank you all for your time and for sticking around for this conversation. We really appreciate it. We will do another one next week, and we hope to take up some of the questions that we didn't get to next week as well. So